All right, welcome back to Professor Greg's class, where today we are talking about an advanced writing topic, an advanced business writing topic, but really just an advanced topic for writers in general, which is the rhetorical situation, and trying to really pinpoint and figure out what kind of writers we are and what kind of writers we want to be. Basic writing is sentence structure, it's grammatical rules, its syntax, is all of these other things. More advanced writing requires a scaffolding of the mind and the spirit, right? It's a recognition of the humanities and the humanity in others, and it's a recognition of the humanity in the self, right? Today we are going to be discussing the rhetorical situation, an article by Lloyd Blitzer, which is particularly good. And there you go. I'm going to add a little more excitement to our lives. As we're thinking and as we're meditating on what it means to be better kind of, I guess, rhetorical writers with the rhetorical situation, I want us also to be thinking about what really we want to take away from this in kind of a critical way. So we're going to discuss kind of the article and some points that he makes, but ultimately I want us to really reflect back on what kind of writers we want to be. So one of your kind of tasks, I would say, to take away from this video is what kind of writer do you want to be, right? So first, what I would argue is for you to consider what kind of author you want to be, what kind of relationship do you want to have with your reader, and what kind of relationship do you want to have with your subject. So do you want to have an adversarial relationship with your reader, right? Are you angry at them for some reason? And do you want to express that anger? Do you want to convince them of a point? Are you trying to be persuasive? And then what do you think is the most responsible step to take in order to engage in that persuasiveness? Now, I'm not talking about persuasiveness for the sake of manipulation. I'm talking about persuasiveness for the sake of recognizing that another person is a human and that you're trying to teach them something, right? And sort of bring them over to your side, right, of an issue. And then what kind of relationship do you want to have with your subject, right? What are you actually writing about? Are you writing about people? When we are going to be talking a lot about data narratives, right, as a genre, using data to develop our rhetorical situations, using data to develop the vocabulary and the language that we use. What relationship do we want to have with the actual people that we're studying? Do we want them to remain as numbers, or do we want to start making sure that we're injecting this fluctuation between microcosmic and macrocosmic, right? Looking at these large scale numbers and then thinking, well, how are people actually impacted by this, right? How is the individual actually impacted? And I think that if you're going to be doing powerful and persuasive writing, if you're going to be doing writing, especially in the business world that has a lot at stake, you have to start developing a real sympathetic view of how you engage in writing, the types of discourse that you use, and then the result, right, and the consequences that your words have, and that the action, right, the political action of creating language, right, and what that means. So what I hope you'll take away from this series of videos is that you'll begin to think of the responsibility that you have as a writer and as a high-level writer, as someone who's writing for an audience and who's writing to hopefully impact some change, right? In Lloyd Blitzer's article, he sets up a lot of like the general vocabulary that you're gonna generally need to really just think about these things, right? Considering situations, right, and the vocabulary that the situations create, or more specifically, the vocabulary that the situations necessitate, right? So it can be kind of a tricky thing to wrap your head around, but it's just a sort of more well-rounded way of looking at how we start writing and how we think of writing. You might be, engulfed in a situation, or you might have a topic and you might just kind of sit down and just start kind of clanking out language. But what Lloyd Blitzer, I think, is arguing for is for you to take sort of a more holistic approach to thinking about how language is created and how vocabulary is created, and specifically thinking about, okay, here's the situation, here's the different perspectives, Here's what warrants this language. Here's what necessitates it. Here's what makes language appropriate, right? And I would urge you to think about that specifically. Is my language appropriate? Oops. Okay. Thank God for spell check. Is my language warranted by the situation? Is it appropriate? And I'm sure you've all read, whether maybe your friends are texting you, or maybe you're reading an article and you say like, oh, I think that they're responding disproportionately, right, to the situation. That was you being a rhetorician, right? And that was you doing rhetorical analysis. You might not have realized it, right, because you're just reading a friend's text message. But that's the kind of thought process that you want to engage in. Is, did I take a moment to step back, and is there too much emotion, right, in the language that I'm creating? Or, interestingly enough, is there not enough emotion, right? Maybe there's real lives at stake and you're writing about something like very robotically, or maybe you're cracking jokes. That's the kind of rhetorical stuff that I want to introduce you to, and then we'll begin kind of refining and looking at some of the more the more in-depth look at these things as this video series continues. So here's just kind of two examples that I'd like us to think about. You've looked through rhetorical situation at this point, and here's just kind of some things I want you to think about. So here's a data visualization. We'll be talking about data narratives and analyzing them and creating our own. This comes from Richmond University. It's called Mapping Inequality, is the name of the project, redlining in the New Deal in America. And, it does a really excellent job, I would say, of giving us a great kind of overview as you kind of click through things. You can look at these different maps. But when we look at our own mapping software and we think about the data narratives that we're going to create, that's going to give us a very high level view of these situations, which is good, right? We want to engage with the space, we want to create a landscape, and we want to hopefully immerse our audience, right, in language, in the vocabulary that we create, in the arguments and in the meaning, and we want them to see a physical space, right? That's the whole point of data narratives, is to make for a more immersive storytelling experience. But the danger of that, right, is that it might become a little too impersonal, right? So we want to begin having things where we can begin kind of zooming into the microcosmic level, so that we balance that macrocosmic. Here's the large scale numbers, here's the large scale view, here's the large scale situation. And that's important because it shows us why we need to be doing this, right? If it's not affecting a massive number of people, it can be hard to have a massive movement, right? Or a massive attention placed on it. You need to make a case for both. You have to show that it's affecting a large number of people, and that there's data to kind of back that up. But then you also have to begin sort of zooming in, and you want that kind of balanced zooming in motion, right? So here, this actually does a pretty good job. You can begin kind of clicking on like the individual places, and it really does let you zoom in. But I would argue that you should take it one step further, and to really make your data narratives feel complete, you need to honor the individual. And I want to actually write that into the notes here, right? Honor. So you want to honor the individual, and you also want to honor the crowd, right? And honor the population, the singular person as well as the family, right? And fluctuating between what it means to be a singular person affected by something versus us as kind of all being part of a human family, and then what that means, and making a case based around that. I'll finish now, right, with that explanation, with what I think to be one of the best, what I would argue is a data narrative that's been written, in recent history. It's called The Case for Reparations by Ta-Nehisi Coates, and it's a brilliant and sweeping historical look at the ways in which African American people in America have been affected by 90 years of Jim Crow, right? 250 years of slavery, 90 years of Jim Crow, 60 years of separate but equal, 35 years of racist housing policy, right? And then his argument being, until we reckon with our compounding moral debts, America will never be whole. Many of you, for your data narrative projects, will be doing work exactly like this, right? Looking at these large scale, over history, over time, over large populations, looks at social justice issues or any other issue. And it might be tempting to start with the statistics, right? And to look at and say, 90% of this or 50% of that, right? And to take that kind of macrocosmic look, which is fine. You can begin that way. But look at what Coates does, right? He begins with, so that's just one of my losses, and he begins with an individual, right? Clyde Ross was born in 1923. And so now you as an audience, right, that there's going to be a difference here between starting and looking at the statistics about redlining, the statistics about Jim Crow that we generally know, I think, as a culture. There's going to be a difference in this article because we're going to be looking at individuals that it actually impacts, and we're going to be looking at case studies of how these large-scale societal systems affect individuals in a very, very personal way, right? So it's one way to say, well, the African American community suffers because their inheritance has been interrupted during multiple major events, right, throughout the last 400 or so years. It's one thing to say that. It's another thing to really show it, right, and to show it in a personal way, and to fluctuate between the personal experience alongside with the large-scale macro look at how this larger machine operates, right? So this is something that I'm going to urge all of you to begin to consider as you work through the long process of becoming a rhetorician, which I would argue is so much more than just learning the rules of writing, and so much more about trying to figure out who you are in a very kind of, I hesitate to say spiritual sense, but sort of, right? In like a spiritual sense, like who you want to be as a writer, what you want to express, how you want to make the complicated thoughts and feelings in your head, how you want to make those known in a way that is informationally fluent. And in fact, in the next video, we're going to be talking about this, information fluency. Once you start meditating on what kind of writer you want to be, then we have to start thinking about the actually taking the actions, right, of going through the motions and becoming informationally fluent, taking that writer that you imagine in your head and putting it down onto the paper, right, and onto the screen. So good luck, right, and I'll see you guys in the next video.